Across America, television sets flicker on for what millions of viewers assumed would be another rerun of the popular Western series Bonanza. Instead, the President of the United States appears on screen, interrupting the broadcast for a 15-minute address he's calling his new economic policy. Richard Nixon speaks about inflation, about unemployment, about what he calls an all-out war being waged on the American dollar by international speculators. And then, buried in the middle of a 15-minute speech, in a single sentence most viewers didn't fully register at the time, he changes the world forever. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That word did a lot of work that night. It let American allies believe this was a short-term emergency measure, something to be reversed once markets calmed down. It let ordinary Americans change the channel back to Bonanza without a second thought. It let the moment pass without the panic it probably deserved. The gold window Nixon closed that night has never reopened. Not the next year. Not the next decade. Not once in the 50-plus years since. Every dollar, euro, pound, and yen you've ever spent in your entire life has existed under the system born in that single, deliberately undersold sentence. A system with no metal behind it at all, backed by nothing but trust, policy, and the promise of a government's word. This is the story of the weekend that quietly ended one era of money and built the one we're all still living in. Part 1. A system running out of gold. To understand why Nixon made the decision he did, you have to understand the slow-motion crisis that had been building for years before that Sunday night broadcast. The system Nixon was about to blow up had been built 27 years earlier, in July 1944, when representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war monetary order. The result pegged the U.S. dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce and pegged every other major currency to the dollar. It made the dollar the anchor of the entire global financial system and gave the United States an extraordinary degree of economic power, precisely because everyone else's money was, in effect, defined in terms of America's. For that system to work, though, the United States had to actually hold enough gold to honor its promise, that any foreign government holding dollars could, at any time, exchange them for real gold at that fixed rate. In the years right after World War II, that wasn't a problem. America held roughly 3/4 of the entire world's official gold reserves. But by the late 1960s, the math had started to break down. Europe and Japan had rebuilt their economies far faster than anyone expected, and their exports were now genuinely competing with America's, eroding the dominance the U.S. economy had enjoyed since 1944. At the same time, the United States was spending enormous, escalating sums fighting the war in Vietnam, spending that was increasingly financed not through taxes, but through the printing of more dollars. More dollars in circulation meant rising inflation at home, and a growing pile of dollars sitting in foreign central banks abroad. Dollars those countries were, by treaty, entitled to convert into gold whenever they chose. France, in particular, grew openly hostile toward the arrangement. President Charles de Gaulle had long argued that the dollar's special status gave the United States what French officials called an exorbitant privilege: the unique ability to run deficits and print money without facing the same consequences any other country would. Through the late 1960s, France began actively demanding conversion of its dollar reserves into physical gold, at one point reportedly sending a ship to New York specifically to collect it. Other countries watched and began quietly doing the same. The numbers tell the rest of the story. America's gold reserves, which had stood at over 20,000 tons after the war, had fallen to roughly 8,100 tons by 1971, even as the total volume of dollars held overseas, all theoretically redeemable, kept climbing. Something had to give. Either America's remaining gold or the fixed-rate system built around it. Part 2. The Weekend at Camp David. By August 1971, Nixon's economic advisors could see the crisis accelerating in real time. On August 9th, Switzerland, traditionally one of the most conservative, currency-stable nations in the world, withdrew from the dollar-gold system entirely, converting its dollar holdings. Days later, France sent a warship to New York to physically retrieve French gold from the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank. The pressure on the United States to act, one way or another, had become impossible to ignore. So on the weekend of August 13th through 15th, 1971, Nixon summoned a tight circle of 15 advisors to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, for a closed-door meeting that would decide the fate of the international monetary system. Among those in the room, Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Undersecretary for International Monetary Affairs Paul Volcker, who would later become one of the most consequential Fed chairmen in American history, and top aides George Shultz and Peter Peterson. The meeting was, by design, secretive. No foreign governments were consulted. No advance warning was given to America's closest allies, the very countries whose currencies were about to be thrown into turmoil. The debate inside Camp David was reportedly contentious. Not everyone in the room agreed on how far to go. But by the end of the weekend, the group had settled on a three-part plan, one that Connally himself is said to have privately predicted would never be reversed. Meeting with Nixon 2 weeks before the announcement, Connally reportedly told him, "We may never go back to it. I suspect we never will." 50-plus years later, he's been right every single day since. It's also worth being honest about the political backdrop. 1972 was a re-election year for Nixon, and a domestic economy struggling with both inflation and unemployment was a serious political liability. The plan crafted at Camp David wasn't purely a response to an international currency crisis. It was also engineered, in real time, to hand Nixon a politically popular story of decisive action heading into his campaign. Part 3. The 15-minute speech that rewrote the rules. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation with what he formally titled, "Address to the Nation Outlining a New Economic Policy, The Challenge of Peace." It contained 3 major measures, and only one of them was permanent. The first was a 90-day freeze on wages and prices across the entire American economy, an extraordinary peacetime intervention into private markets, designed to break the inflationary spiral that had been building since the mid-1960s. The second was a 10% surcharge on all dutiable imports, a blunt tariff designed to pressure America's trading partners into letting their currencies rise in value against the dollar, making American exports more competitive. The third measure is the one that actually changed the world. Nixon announced that he had directed Treasury Secretary Connally to suspend, in his words, temporarily, the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, closing what economists call the gold window. Foreign governments holding dollars could no longer exchange them for American gold. Full stop. Nixon framed the entire announcement in the language of strength, not retreat. "In recent weeks," he told the country, "the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy, and the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators." It's a curious sentence in hindsight. The speculators Nixon described weren't shadowy villains. They were largely foreign governments and central banks doing exactly what the Bretton Woods Treaty entitled them to do: convert dollars they legitimately held into the gold America had promised to provide. Nixon wasn't defending the dollar from an attack. He was defending America's remaining gold reserves from a promise the United States could no longer afford to keep. Part 4. The World Finds Out Live. For America's allies, The most jarring part of the announcement wasn't just the substance. It was the fact that they learned about it exactly the same way ordinary Americans did, watching it unfold on live television with zero advance consultation. In the following 3 months, the dollar dropped roughly 7.5% against the West German mark alone, and pressure mounted globally to formally restructure the entire pegged exchange rate system Bretton Woods had been built on. That December, finance ministers and central bankers from the world's wealthiest economies gathered at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., to negotiate a fix. The resulting Smithsonian agreement devalued the dollar by roughly 8.5% against gold, moving the official rate from $35 an ounce to 38, and by an average of 12.5% against the currencies of America's major trading partners. Crucially, though, direct gold convertibility was never restored. The gold window Nixon closed in August stayed closed. The Smithsonian Agreement was meant to save the pegged exchange rate system in a patched-up form. It didn't last. Currency pressures kept building, and by March 1973, less than a year and a half after Nixon's speech, the world's major economies abandoned fixed exchange rates altogether, allowing currencies to float freely against one another based on market supply and demand, exactly as they still do today. The Bretton Woods system, built so carefully in 1944, was, for all practical purposes, dead. Part 5. OUR currency, your problem. If you want one sentence that captures exactly how one-sided this entire episode felt to the rest of the world, it came from Treasury Secretary John Connally himself, at a G10 finance ministers meeting in Rome later in 1971. Facing a room of stunned European counterparts still reeling from Nixon's unilateral announcement, Connally delivered a line that has echoed through international finance for over 50 years since. The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. Connally reportedly told Nixon privately around the same period, "My philosophy, Mr. President, is that all foreigners are out to screw us, and it's our job to screw them first." Blunt, undiplomatic, and, according to the officials who sat across the table from him, an accurate summary of exactly how Washington was treating its closest allies during this entire episode. That single sentence, "Our currency, your problem," is really the emotional center of gravity for this whole story. The United States hadn't asked permission to close the gold window. It hadn't coordinated the decision with the allies whose economies would be shaken by it. It had made a unilateral choice in America's own interest, absorbed the political credit for looking decisive at home, and left every other country on earth to simply adjust to the consequences. Nearly 55 years later, the American economist Kenneth Rogoff would use that exact Connally quote as the title of a book about the decades of dollar dominance that followed, because the dynamic it captured never really went away. Part 6. The birth of money made from nothing. Here's the part of the story that's easy to state simply but hard to fully absorb. Since August 15, 1971, not a single major currency on Earth has been backed by gold or by any other physical commodity. Every dollar, pound, euro, and yen in existence today is what economists call fiat currency, money that has value purely because governments say it does, and because enough people collectively agree to trust that promise. The scale of the shift, viewed from 50-plus years later, is genuinely staggering. Gold, freed from its fixed $35 peg, has been allowed to trade purely on market forces ever since, and its price has climbed from that $35 anchor to well over $3,000 an ounce by the mid-2020s, an extraordinary decline in the dollar's purchasing power measured against the one asset the entire system used to be built on. Was this good or bad for the world? Economists genuinely disagree, and it's worth presenting both sides honestly. Supporters point out that floating fiat currencies gave central banks, including the Federal Reserve, far more flexibility to manage their own economies, respond to recessions, and avoid the kind of rigid, gold supply-constrained policy that had arguably deepened the Great Depression decades earlier. Critics, meanwhile, argue that removing the discipline of a gold-backed system opened the door to exactly the kind of sustained, structural inflation and currency devaluation that has defined the decades since, measured in that same climb from $35 an ounce to thousands. What's not really disputed is this: the Nixon shock didn't just end an old system. It created the operating system every economy on Earth still runs on today. A world where money's value floats, where currencies are actively and continuously traded against one another, and where no government anywhere promises to exchange its paper for a fixed weight of anything at all. Part 7. How the dollar stayed king anyway. Here's the part of the story that answers an obvious question. If Nixon just cut the dollar loose from the one thing that made it the world's trusted anchor currency, why did the dollar remain the world's dominant currency anyway, for the 50-plus years since? The most commonly cited piece of the answer involves Saudi Arabia, though it's worth being precise here, because this part of the story has been heavily distorted by decades of retelling, and accuracy matters. Following the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which saw OPEC roughly quadruple oil prices in a matter of months, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed a formal joint agreement on economic cooperation in June 1974. Contrary to a popular, widely repeated version of this story, that publicly signed 1974 agreement was not, on its own, a formal contract requiring Saudi Arabia to price its oil exclusively in dollars. Saudi Arabia, in fact, continued accepting British pounds for oil sales even after signing it. What's better documented is a separate, more secretive arrangement negotiated around the same period, which stayed classified until a 2016 Freedom of Information request finally brought it to light. The United States offering military equipment, training, and security guarantees to the Saudi royal family, in exchange for Saudi Arabia recycling its enormous new oil wealth back into American Treasury securities and financial markets. Over the following years, informally rather than through one single binding clause, Saudi Arabia, and eventually the rest of OPEC, settled into pricing global oil sales predominantly in U.S. dollars, a practice historians describe as growing out of mutual interest and accumulated precedent as much as any single signed pact. The effect, however it precisely came together, was enormous, because virtually every nation on Earth needs oil, and oil was now overwhelmingly priced and settled in dollars. Every nation on Earth needed to hold significant dollar reserves just to participate in the global energy trade, creating exactly the kind of structural, built-in demand for dollars that gold convertibility used to provide, without America ever having to promise a single ounce of metal in return. By 1975, every OPEC member had followed Saudi Arabia's lead. Economists and journalists would later give this arrangement a name: the petrodollar system. So the full arc of the story looks like this. In August 1971, Nixon cut the dollar's last tie to a fixed, finite physical asset. By the mid-1970s, through a mix of formal diplomacy and quieter security arrangements, the United States had replaced that old anchor with a new one, not gold sitting in a vault, but oil flowing through pipelines, priced in dollars, settled through American banks, creating global demand for the currency all over again. The dollar didn't survive the end of the gold standard by accident. It survived because the United States moved quickly to build something else to take gold's place.